your own time, Audacity. You just think it'd be useful someday. This is why you don't do facecam videos. Just thought I'd take a second to throw in that I can't believe I only just realised as of April that the iPhone low power noise when you're on a phone call sounds straight out of Petscop. Play it. Also follow me on Twitter. Now I know, I've said on probably multiple times before that this is my last Petscop video, and I was intended to be if you don't count the streams, and I was hesitant to even do this one now, because all this basically is an update on Tony and some information about the production of the series, essentially, for if you don't know about it or like me, although I'm doing it now anyway, but whatever, can't be bothered to read the articles that have been released about him. So I thought I may as well do this because I don't really have anything else lined up, so yay. I've saved these as a PDF, so I don't actually know which site this is from. I'll put it on the screen and in the description. I'll link them both in the description. So our first interview. There's something hiding in Petscop. Do you remember being born? Is there such a thing as a curse that can change your past? Can a closed door become an open door without actually opening? Well, no, obviously not. These questions are absurd unless you're watching Petscop. When you're watching Petscop, the very fact that these questions have been asked, and there's a YouTube comment that's distracted me. When you're watching Petscop, the very fact that these questions have been asked hints at a whole world of mystery, one that has kept a dedicated community of viewers hanging on every word, studying every frame, and piecing together what's been treated as a giant, mystifying puzzle. Something like Petscop couldn't really have existed at any previous point in time. It's a series of videos that, at first, appeared to be just amateurish uploads of footage from an unreleased video game, complete with halting, unpracticed voiceovers by the player. It's the kind of thing you might stumble across during a deep dive into YouTube, among thousands of Let's Plays and game analyses that get uploaded on a daily basis. However, it doesn't take long to realise that there's something different about Petscop, and over the course of its 24 videos, it slowly turns into a surreal, haunting, and often unnerving journey, filled with themes of abuse, trauma, and obsession. To say that Petscop isn't a real game is mostly accurate. Nobody ever tried to develop a PS1 game by that name, and all the creators, players, and testers hinted at in the videos are entirely fictional. I don't want to pronounce Tony's surname wrong. Dominico it is. But on Tony Dominico's computer, there's a file called petscop.exe. Everything seen in the Petscop videos comes from that file. Every aspect of Petscop, its programming, graphics, music, voiceovers and recordings was all created by Dominico. He says it all started after he watched a talk called Stop Drawing Dead Fish, which discussed how computer-based art can be alive in ways that drawings and animations can't. Afterwards, he had a dream about a live-streamed puppet show that used a game engine. Dreams being what they are, Dominico has since forgotten the details, but the concept came up again during a conversation with a friend about possible creepy projects they could work on. First, he was talking about the idea of animating a Let's Play by hand, Dominico said. Then, as we talked about it more, it became, what if you actually made the game? I'm probably butchering his surname, I might just say Tony. The more Tony thought about it, the more he realised that he had ideas for what a game of that sort would be like. His dream wasn't the only influence. Tony says that Petscop drew a lot of inspiration from creepypastas such as Ben Drowned, a story regularly shared around the internet about a bootleg copy of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. While playing, the narrator experiences a series of strange events that at first seem to be minor bugs, but as they increase in scope and bleed into real life, he gradually realises that the game may be haunted by its previous owner. I don't know why I bothered with the facecam for this, to be honest. Petscop also drew inspiration from Marble Hornets, a YouTube series that follows the aftermath of a low-budget movie shoot during which the filmmakers ran afoul of the supernatural creature Slenderman. Tony also noted that movies by surrealist filmmaker David Lynch had a huge impact on his work. Inland Empire is probably the largest single influence, he said. You know, this whole thing of being trapped in a cursed film, you can make certain connections. He also drew on some psychological experiments and therapeutic practices. For example, a clear reference is made to the strange situation procedure which is used to observe the attachment between children and their caregivers. There's also a scene that involves playing a board game with what appears to be a school counsellor, a strategy that therapists sometimes use to analyse a young patient's behaviour. It was all stuff I read about years prior, said Tony. I may have read about them further as I was starting, though I don't remember now. On top of all of that, he started working on the project because, well, it sounded kind of easy. I hadn't finished anything substantial in a while and wanted something undaunting to get back into it, Tony said. I guess it started as kind of a shallow thing. Of course, the last word any Petscop fan would use to describe the series is shallow. That's something that's made clear in the very first video when you hear the nervous-sounding voice of the character Paul, who explains to an unnamed person why he's uploading the videos. In a normal Let's Play, the style of dialogue would be a turn-off, indication that Paul is nothing but an amateur who has no idea how to make a video interesting for his audience. But in the context of Petscop, it adds a thick layer of realism that sucks the viewer in. Most of us, if we tried uploading something to YouTube, would sound like Paul. Gee, thanks. Stumbling over sentences, struggling to put into words exactly what's on our minds. He's never outright explained who Paul is talking to, but there's clearly a backstory between the two characters, with hints scattered throughout the series that are left for the viewer to piece together on their own, with varying degrees of success, I must say. That's what goes with a lot of things in Petscop. Nothing is said explicitly, but there are plenty of breadcrumbs that imply something larger and darker at play. Like a comment on the original Petscop 2, Petscop summed up. That's probably important, but I don't know. I like stuff that leaves a lot of room for the imagination, Tony said. The way I thought about it was, I'm only showing a slice of things. I hope to get across a feeling like there's a lot more here, something strange and complex happening in the background, and you just aren't getting a full view of it. The puzzles themselves are a little unusual, but they follow a sort of logic that a player could reasonably figure out given enough time to experiment. If you pay enough attention, however, you'll notice that something's off about a number of little details. A sign laments that we have failed to remove all the pets from their homes. Another sign tells the player not to be discouraged if they run from you. A trophy calls one pet a real champ for its refusal to leave the cage. To make sense of this, Tony said, you need to try and get into the mind of the fictional game's developer. That beginning part of Petscop was still created by someone, Tony said. That's a really important thing. Everything is there because somebody decided to put it there. And so you can wonder who was it and what was their state of mind. Any unease caused by these strange elements are soon found to be justified by the end of the first video, where it's revealed that the game contains an entire hidden world that dwarfs what's on the surface. Yeah, we know this. Petscop wasn't shared to the public until after the first 4 videos were uploaded, and there was already a lot to digest in that first wave. It's creepy, though not in any way that threatens anyone directly. It's kind of a slow burn that strongly implies that there's something horribly wrong. It's a kind of horror that Tony wishes there were more of. Every October I'm like, here's that mood again, and I get kind of excited about it, he says. And then I remember that the majority is cheese, or pure misery, or torture, or all of the above. That is not my thing. The whole vibe repels me and makes me feel kind of sick. Interestingly here, the tool is referred to as looking like an awl or a gourd or a womb, which could just be speculation on the part of the author, or could have been said by Tony, for all we know, so I'm just throwing it out there even though we already know what tool looks like. If you don't, what are you doing here? And why are you still here after however long it's been? Each example has its own purpose, but in general I felt it important to me that I take advantage of the fake game format, Tony said. This meant doing things that I couldn't reasonably do in a real game. It all creates a feeling of dread that's hard to put a finger on. Tony doesn't think he's the only person who wants that kind of experience in a horror work. I don't even necessarily know what I want, Tony said, but I always want something really strongly and can't find it. A lot of stuff on the internet these days is getting so close. People are actively looking for it now, whatever it is. A day after the 4th video was published, it was shared to the public on a small subreddit called r/creepygaming by a user named P.A. Leskowitz. Tony confirmed he was indeed the one behind the account. Alright Matt, Pat, I'll give you that one. The title of the post was fairly straightforward. Videos of a mysterious unfinished PSX game from 1997 called Petscop. There's something hiding in it. I was expecting mixed reactions, Tony said. I thought people might think it was stupid and was bracing myself for that. Needless to say, that wasn't quite what happened. The replies were universally positive, and that initial Reddit post ended up being the only time Tony ever needed to directly promote one of his videos. Viewers started latching on to all the connections and implications of everything and getting drawn into the uncanny atmosphere that left them ill at ease. They noticed the hidden images in the loading screens and the things in the background that Paul didn't seem to notice. It drew people into the narrative, and that was by design. There's this thing, which Marble Hornets may have made popular, of involving people in your videos by hiding things in them, giving off a feeling that there's maybe more here that you aren't seeing, Tony said. That's great, especially for the people who never find those hidden things. Just knowing there's something that you aren't seeing creates a great atmosphere for horror. It soon became clear to viewers that there were shapes, ideas, characters and themes that were all repeated and tied together in ways that hinted at something going on that's much larger than an unfinished game. And so, Petscop's popularity began to grow. A community gathered around the videos, a subreddit, a wiki, a Discord server. Thousands, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people subscribed to the Petscop YouTube channel. After it started blowing up, I felt sick for a while because I didn't know what was going to happen. But after that wore off, it was just fun, Tony said. It was such pure luck, it feels absurd sometimes. Part of the community became dedicated to finding connections and meanings. YouTube channels like Game Theory, Nightmare Masterclass and Pyrocynical made their own analysis videos. In addition to the wiki, fans wrote an 129-page said Google Doc documenting what they knew, all in the hopes of getting to the bottom of just what was happening. Tony tended not to look at those discussions. He found that reading the theories and discoveries was unsettling. In general, it's uncomfortable when people look at your work through a magnifying glass. Sorry. But also, people approach things in very different ways, and I think that's great, but I don't need to see it all. He would, however, pop into the Discord and subreddit after he released a video. Viewers' initial responses were something he found far more interesting than the in-depth speculation that followed. I liked reading immediate reactions because those were more based on the feeling of the video, Tony said, but those reactions were filtered through words, of course. It might have been nice to actually see more people watch the videos for the first time as they were being released. Tony had been making games, music, and art for over a decade by the time he created Petscop. He'd never received anything close to this type of response to anything he'd made before. Before Petscop, his game 8 Capsule, created for a 2010 contest in the I give up trying to pronounce things properly source forums, was the project that had garnered the most attention. The rather abstract puzzle game requires players to figure out which objects to throw at which targets in order to progress to the next level. It placed third in the contest and eventually faded into obscurity.
That's a dead kid.
After Petscop ended though, people started looking at Tony's old work again. The game that received most attention, called Nifty, shares certain elements with his more famous work. The two games are purportedly made by the same fictional company, and some of the same cryptic symbols are shared between them. Both have darker stories lurking beneath what at first glance appears to be an innocent, if quirky game. I enjoyed that continuity. It felt like I'd been slowly developing this thing over time, Tony said. There were a few people who played Nifty back in the day, and I wanted to communicate that feeling to them as well. When Tony started Nifty, he intended to create exactly the sort of simple abstract puzzle game that it first appears to be on the surface, but that didn't turn out to be very interesting, he admitted. To spice things up, he started making levels that caused things to go completely off the rails. The result was a game with outside-the-box puzzles that forced players to read the game's config files, delete saves, and edit file contents. I was learning Game Maker, and I wanted to use all the features of Game Maker that I could for the puzzles, Tony explained. There's also a very creepypasta-esque backstory hidden behind Nifty, involving hints at previous releases of the game that caused emotional attachment to its main character that eventually led to several cases of suicide. It's the kind of creepy story that appeals to Tony, the kind where you feel a sense of dread not just for the characters on screen, but for yourself as well. It's not that you're scared of anything in particular, it's like when you're a kid and you haven't been in this universe long enough to have this really solidified feeling of what can and can't happen in it, Tony said. So it's like anything can happen, people could jump out of your TV, that kind of thing. I love trying to bring myself back to that. I think you can do it by messing with basic expectations, operating on a foreign set of rules, making it difficult to predict what's going to happen. Tony announced on Twitter that the game only has superficial similarities to Petscop, but now he admits that there's more to it than that. We've got the whole PCU coming on here. Can't deny that there's a certain thematic continuity stretching across all that stuff. It's more accurate to say that they aren't canonically related. Scratch what I just said then. Despite being such an enigmatic piece of work with ties to his more popular creations, Tony would rather people don't dig up his old stuff. I'm not proud of that stuff, as it exists. I mean, that's part of why I recycle ideas, he said. For the people who didn't already know about my work, I'd rather Petscop bury those old things than draw attention to them. But of course, that's not how it works. And yet, Tony admits that when he finished Nifty, he couldn't keep his mind off what he'd created. Petscop evolved partly from Nifty, he said. I kept thinking about that game after I finished it. I developed a whole story around it, which I combined with other ideas I had, and eventually it became its own thing. For anyone paying attention, the rough outline of Petscop's narrative isn't too difficult to hash out. It revolves around a man named Marvin, a tragedy that killed his childhood friend Lena, and an incident in which Marvin kidnaps his own daughter, who he believes to be Lena reborn. There's also a failed attempt to change a girl named Belle into someone named Tiara. Knew it! It was pretty obvious by the end, but you know. A traffic accident and a connection between Paul, the game, and his family. But if that's all there was to it, it wouldn't have garnered such a dedicated fanbase that still wants to figure out its mysteries and what different parts of the videos imply about the story, the nature of the game, and what exactly it is that they're watching. What, for instance, does playing Stravinsky's Septet have to do with rebirthing? What is the purpose behind the two characters from different years in the Ghost Room? What are we meant to learn from the video of dozens of Pyramid Head characters? There is a story that ties it all together, Tony said. He set forward with an idea of who the characters were, what their motivations were, and what the meaning behind the events was. Having that in place, he believes, means that the viewers can intuitively sense that everything ties together. He's not going to tell us what he had in mind though, and he allowed his gut feelings to influence what showed up in the videos. I chose what details I wanted to include based on what felt good, Tony said. Now that it's over, that's it. Saying more would be like extending the series. That's what Disney thought about Star Wars. In fact, he intentionally left gaps in the story because he felt like adding too much detail would ruin the sense of ambiguity that he was aiming for. This led him to scrapping some work when he realised it set too many things in stone. Early on, I wrote a lot of stuff for a Petscop Discovery Pages website that I was going to release with the first video, along with a developer journal. That material could have destroyed the series immediately, Tony said. I used that website in a later video, too small to be readable, and that was the perfect amount of detail. You can just make out the pictures and see how much text there is, and you're in front of a page called Your Child, and that's all the information needed. I was so happy with that. He says his viewers seem to have understood most of the themes he was trying to get across, but if his goal was to outright explain his intentions, he wouldn't have made such a hard-to-penetrate series to begin with. There's room for interpreting it in different ways, based on your own experiences and what you care about, said Tony. I prefer not to explain it in words myself, because that would take away from personal interpretations, and because I think too much is lost in that translation into words. Tony has remained insistent that his viewers' personal interpretations are more important than anything he had in his head when he made the videos. He's too close to the work to accurately analyse it. Anything he gets out of Petscop would be based on his thoughts while creating it, rather than the seeing what's actually in the videos. After working on something for a long time, your perspective is really messed up, Tony said. I say other people have a more valid perspective because, for better or for worse, it's more based off the work as it actually Go away, house party. But you've literally never bothered me before, and you choose to do it now. I say other people have a more valid perspective because, for better or for worse, it's more based on the work as it actually exists. Some of his fans have shown frustration at these statements, many of them having approached the series' mysteries as something that they were meant to get to the bottom of through carefully inspecting all of the details. That wasn't Tony's intention. It's not a puzzle to be solved, and there's nothing that I would call a solution, he says. I like ambiguity, not as a teaser or challenge, but as something that stands on its own. It's not even that Tony wants his fans to come up with their own stories about what happened. He just thinks that the sense of uncertainty and fear that comes with the series to be the main focus. It's not that I'm asking people to literally fill in the blanks with their own answers either. That's fine, but if you do that, you've removed the ambiguity and changed the atmosphere of the entire thing, he said. Who would try and do something like that? Yeah. Even so, the hand of authorial intent is still visible in some elements of the series. Themes of childhood trauma and rebirth, for example, are impossible to miss. There's this sort of abstract idea of being lost and corrupted in an irreparable way that just feels so deeply sad and scary. Also, different ideas and images feed into this. Rebirth feeds into it easily, Tony said. It doesn't come from experience, though. I had a good childhood. One thing that Petscop is not meant to be about, Tony insists, is the death of Candice Newmaker. However, the series did make direct references to that tragedy. These references took on a life of their own once they were discovered. Many people following the series fixated on them, with the belief spreading that Petscop was about the case. This was not Tony's intent. After revealing himself as the creator of Petscop, Tony tweeted out an admission that the references were intentional, and said that including them was extremely stupid of him. The references, Tony said, were only meant to tie into the themes of rebirth that are seen throughout the series. Looking back, he says he believes it wasn't appropriate to reference a real-life tragedy in a work like Petscop. A decision like that, to reference a tragedy involving real people, should have a lot of weight to it. It should have been something I treated very carefully. I did not treat it carefully enough. But also, I feel that the series was just not the place for that kind of thing. When he came to this realization, he made a few changes to how the series would play out. The changes were subtle, because I was never going to go much deeper with the references, Tony said. Mainly, I avoided using the name Newmaker again. I didn't want to emphasize it any more than I already had. As I'm sure I've said before, or at least said in a comment or something, personally I always assumed that the inclusion of that was as kind of a throw-off, I suppose, a diversion. Particularly as all of the clues for it were so early on, and yeah, it does fit the same kind of thing. Much a similar kind of technique as I used, which is kind of similar to what I had a bit of a go at in the late stages of these, which I don't know, I might release these someday, who knows. Although that basically just is the 2017 and 2018 of my life documented, so that's kind of... But later on I used what happened in a specific way to try and divert expectations from what would eventually happen. I didn't realise I was doing it until after the end happened, so I knew how it ended. So then I looked back and thought, yeah, if anyone asked, that's definitely what I was going for from the start. You carry on. With Petscop now behind him, Tony set his sights on another project, one that he says he'll complete in its entirety before he starts revealing it to the public. One thing he will share is that it will apparently have some connection to the 1997 PC game Lego Island. I love that game. It's the silly and relaxed atmosphere, plus the mystery of it. I mean, at the time I thought there were secrets, but actually I'd already seen everything, Tony said. There's not much to it. These days I also like it because it's so rough and broken. Tony said that there's still an element of horror to the project, but that he plans to tell the story in a much more straightforward manner than Petscop. Other than that, he doesn't have much that he wants to reveal yet. It's still pretty early on, Tony said. Though I have a lot planned, those plans usually change dramatically as a project goes on. He also sees this new endeavour as a welcome change of pace following a project that's taken up the last few years of his life. I loved making Petscop, and I'm proud of it, and I'm happy that I get to move on to something else, Tony said. Okay, right, that took longer than I expected, but now on to the second article. This one that I believe was on BandCamp, where the soundtrack was released. This one, being from BandCamp, is largely about the music, and there's not much to it in terms of that, but I'll read them anyway. The atmosphere of Petscop, which subverts our nostalgic responses in order to evoke discomfort and fear, owes much to its masterfully constructed soundtrack. The music and sound, series creator Tony says, helped me understand what I was doing with everything else. Tony is his own... I'm going to mess that up. Composer to a number of Lynch projects, most notably the Twin Peaks theme, and wields his command of the late 90s video game music and sound design vocab to create his own uncanny Why are there so many words I don't know here? Melodic, infectious, and unsettling. Level 1, a recurring track throughout the series, immediately evokes 32-bit era soundtracks, with its squelchy compressed samples and jaunty marching rhythm. The accompaniment drops out as the main motif The accompaniment drops out as the main motif modulates briefly to a different key, while a strange metallic music words creeps into the mix. Elsewhere, Bathroom-Tomb, a gorgeous MIDI organ hymnal, recalls the tinny sentimental musical moments of classic JRPGs before settling into an uncomfortably sustained chord. One moment you're imagining yourself playing video games in your basement as a child, the next the floor has vanished and your surroundings are unrecognisable. The back half of the soundtrack skews further ambient, using the same palette to evoke a singular sense of anxiety and loneliness on pieces like Driving and School. Tony's command of the uncanny makes the familiar disconcertingly unfamiliar. That was really difficult to read for some reason. I've really offended any people who are into music, haven't I? So, that's Tony. I don't really have anything else to say, apart from my hair. Let's just end on that. Nice. I would say this is my last Petscop video, but let's face it, something else will happen and I'll make another one.